Go ahead in there.
Make yourself comfortable, pal.
When it became clear that his story was not matching with the evidence that we had, he says, all right, I did it.
I did it.
Let's see right in there.
It's really unclear how much she knows at that point.
Such an idiot.
She was a young girl who had a lot to go for in her life and got hooked up with the wrong guy.
They were in adjacent rooms, and he was screaming, I love you, to her.
I know you can hear me. You never stop loving you. It's okay.
It was a toxic relationship.
They're an ordinary couple just ring shopping while he's lying dead in the garage.
I'm here for you.
Love can make people do a lot of crazy things. Love can make people do anything they put their mind to.
Just 90 minutes from New York City, Asbury Park, New Jersey is a beachside community nestled in the heart of the Jersey Shore.
Asbury Park is a shore town. It gets exceptionally busy in the summertime, family friendly. There's a big boardwalk. It attracts a lot of people looking for a good time.
You don't see as much violent crime, but it still exists.
On February 9th, 2017, a young woman, Tracy, walked into the Asbury Park Police Department and reported her boyfriend, Trupal Patel, to be missing. She had last heard from Trupal Patel on February 6th of 2017.
Tracy had said that they had spent the morning together, and she knew that he was going to Asbury Park. She didn't know why, but they had had some plans to get together for a celebration for his birthday, and she had been calling him. He hadn't been responding.
Tracy was incredibly concerned for Trupal. She believed that something had happened to him.
Authorities asked Tracy for more information about Trupal and learned that the 28-year-old was born in India.
They were a loving family. They had means. They weren't poor by any stretch of the imagination. They, at some point, moved to New Jersey to live their life. They were running their own convenience store.
Trupal came into his own and developed a great many friendships.
The first time I met Trupal, I was bartending, and he just got off of work one day and somehow ended up at my bar and started talking to him. I knew that he was a forever friend. Trupal wanted to make sure that everyone was happy around him. Trupal was just one of a kind. Man that would give you shirt off his back.
He was known to be very generous with his friends, things like picking up dinner tabs or picking up the tab for drinks.
He paid like the whole bill every time he went out with us. Always tipped well. Money wasn't an issue. There was not a bad bone in that guy's body.
In February of 2015, Trupal met Tracy, and the two instantly clicked.
Trupal and Tracy had dated for several years.
Trupal wanted to spend all of his free time with her. Anytime there was a holiday or a birthday, Tracy was Trupal's go-to person.
Just one day shy of Trupal's 29th birthday, Tracy has enlisted police to help find her boyfriend.
Tracy did not believe that he would just take off and not respond to her calls and, calls and text messages from other friends. She was pretty adamant that something had happened to him.
Tracy tells authorities that Trupal hasn't been to his apartment in 3 days, and his car isn't parked there either.
You're going to give the police department identifiable characteristics of that person. In this case, it was a large Buddha tattoo that Trupal Patel had on his back.
We asked about some things that he would have been wearing at the time, and one of those things was a very nice Movado watch. As I recall, it was a black face with diamonds around it. The car that Trupal Patel drove was rather unique. in that it was a 2003 black Jaguar with a standard shift transmission.
The police compile a flyer that's distributed to law enforcement. Local jails and hospitals would also be checked.
Posters are going up, comments are being made on social media. The word is out that Trupel is missing, and he is nowhere in sight. There is not a sign of Trupel anywhere.
2 hours later, a local tow truck driver contacts police.
AAA notified the Asbury Park Police Department because they found Trupel Patel's car.
Trupel's car was found in Asbury Park.
It was unoccupied and had been parked on the side of the road.
The driver explains he was hired by someone claiming to be locked out of the Jaguar.
AAA notified the Asbury Park Police Department because they realized that they weren't the actual owner of the vehicle.
When investigators arrive, they are greeted by the tow truck driver and are stunned to see who made the call to the tow truck company, Trupel's girlfriend, Tracy.
Tracy and Trupel's friends conducted their own investigation into Trupel being missing. They distributed missing persons flyers throughout the Asbury Park area. Tracy and Trupel's friends locate Trupel's car parked outside of an auto body shop on Langford Street in Asbury Park.
Once they found Trupel Patel's car, they tried to gain access to it by calling AAA.
They were concerned that he might have been in the trunk.
Authorities decide to act on Tracy's concerns.
There was entry made into the car to see if Trupel happened to be in the trunk. He was not.
There were no signs of any sort of struggle. It didn't look as though the car had been broken into or that there was any signs of foul play.
When investigators press Tracy for more information about Trupel's plans in Asbury Park 3 days earlier, she admits she's been withholding one major piece of information.
Trupel Patel was a marijuana dealer. He dealt in larger quantities of marijuana.
Tracy knew that he was selling drugs and just didn't want to tell the police because they felt that it would sway or kind of prejudice us against Trupel and the possibility that he was a legitimate victim.
Police wanted to know if there was a connection between Trupel's drug dealing and Trupel's disappearance.
He could have developed an enemy from selling marijuana.
Coming up, the discovery of a body shifts the investigation into high gear.
It was quite obvious that there was a human wrapped up in that blanket.
He had been a victim of gunshot wounds.
And a sordid romance takes shape as authorities search for a killer.
Anybody who knew them knew that they had a pretty toxic, sometimes volatile relationship.
Hours after 28-year-old Trupel Patel was reported missing, authorities in Asbury Park, New Jersey have just learned from his girlfriend Tracy that Trupel had been selling marijuana at a local apartment complex the day he disappeared.
On February 6th, the last place Trupel Patel had gone was to Monroe Towers, an apartment building in Asbury Park, to meet with a friend, and he was there to sell her marijuana.
Investigators head for Monroe Towers in order to retrace Trupel's steps.
There were 3 people that Trupel Patel had seen at the Monroe Towers. They were narcotic sales. And we spoke with all of those people, including the manager, who said that he, came, they spoke with him, and that he had left of his own free will.
Surveillance footage shows Trupel Patel leaving the building at about 3:30 on February 6th. He does not look to be in distress. He looks very calm. He is, just a regular guy walking to his car in the parking lot.
Investigators collect the surveillance footage as evidence and return to the station to dig further into Trupel's background. That's when they discover a recent arrest that might provide more clarity on his disappearance.
We learned that prior to Trupel Patel's disappearance, he had recently been arrested.
In 2016, Ocean County had made an arrest of Trupel. He had 4 pounds of marijuana and mushrooms, and he spent a few months in jail. Eventually, Trupel had been released on bail, but he had a court case pending.
They were thinking that he had some pending drug charges and maybe he left town so he didn't have to face those charges.
It kind of lent more towards what may have happened to him, at least a reason as to why he went missing. Quite some time passed. There were no further leads in his missing person case, either through the Asbury Park Police Department or through Tracy and her friends conducting their own canvass of the area.
It just didn't make sense. Like, he wasn't someone who was gonna go away. Like, it wasn't like he was gonna suddenly take a downward spiral. It wasn't anything like that.
On February 22nd, 13 days after the initial missing persons report, police receive a disheartening call.
My office was notified that there was a body found in the Shark River Park. This is approximately 3 miles from Asbury Park along Gully Road in the township of Wall. I immediately head over to the area where the body was located.
And it was down an embankment, almost as if somebody had tossed him and he had rolled down the hill and he had been hidden from view.
This is a rural stretch of road. There's forest on both sides, and it's very dark at night. And the way that the landscape is there, the road is at a level, and then there's a ravine that kind of drops off.
A park ranger had been picking up trash in the area, happened to get further into that area of the park and was able to discover the body.
It was quite obvious that there was a human wrapped up in that blanket. You could see his skin, part of his head was sticking out. I believe you could see his shoes.
His body was actually in very good condition. It was the wintertime, it had been very cold, and it appeared that he had been a victim of gunshot wounds. Detectives were able to make the identification pretty quickly due to a tattoo, a Buddha tattoo that was on his back.
We were able to match that particular tattoo to Trupel Patel. So we immediately initiate a homicide investigation.
Detectives essentially now have to work backwards and figure out how Trupel Patel came to be deceased in Shark River Park. They had to go back to the beginning and try to figure out, who potential suspects even were at that point.
Nearly 2 weeks after 28-year-old Trupel Patel was first reported missing, Asbury Park police have discovered his bullet-riddled body in a residential park.
Detectives at the scene observed gunshot wounds to Trupel's body, and they did not observe any blood in the area. It appeared that his body had been dumped there and he had been pushed down the embankment from the roadway.
We turned the body over to a medical examiner for a closer examination to determine manner and cause of death. After we identified Trupel Patel, we immediately contacted some of the investigators that were involved with his arrest, finding out who he might have been involved with. Did he ever turn state's evidence against anyone in order for a special deal on his charges, things of that nature? Those would have been all reasons that somebody would have wanted Trupel dead, right? But we did not find anything.
When authorities break the news of Trupel's death to his parents, they struggle to process the heartbreaking reality.
They were devastated. I think as any parent would be, they were overcome with grief.
Trupel's family was just, upset to be in this situation, and they really wanted justice for their son.
Trupel's parents can't think of anyone who would want to hurt their son. Trupel's friends share the same sentiment.
Detectives took a number of statements from various friends of Trupel to try to ascertain who might dislike Trupel or have a grudge against him or have any reason to want to kill him.
When they found his body in Shark River, I was just like, who? Who could have done this? Why would someone kill Trupel? Trupel's such a nice guy. He was friends with everyone. How did anyone hurt him?
Everyone had great things to say about him. He was friendly, he was generous, he was never intimidating, he was never threatening. So it came as a shock to people when they learned that he was dead.
He could be described as sort of your friendly neighborhood marijuana dealer, and he predominantly sold marijuana to suburban middle-class individuals.
If someone took from him, he'd be like, okay, well, I'm not going to sell to them again. That was it. It didn't matter to him. He didn't need revenge.
There was, no one that really wanted him deceased in terms of enemies.
The following day, an autopsy report offers investigators further insight into Trupel's murder.
They learned that the cause of death is gunshot wounds, 2 to the head, 1 to the chest.
The medical examiner determined that Trupel Patel was killed with a .22 caliber rifle. Specifically, the murder weapon was identified as a Marlin long rifle.
When investigators compare the autopsy findings to details from Trupel's missing persons report, one item in particular stands out.
Trupel was known to wear a very fancy, very flashy Movado watch, and that watch was not found on his body.
The next thing police are asking themselves is, was this a robbery gone bad? Was Trupel simply a target because of his bling?
Detectives were definitely considering whether robbery was a motive. The missing watch is definitely a lead. You can go to different pawn shops in the area and see if the watch was sold.
Investigators don't get any hits, so they appeal to the public.
At this point, there's no leads, so they turn to the media for help.
They posted information about Trupel as well as his vehicle, a picture of the vehicle. They posted that online and sent it out to news agencies and asked anybody with information to contact the prosecutor's office. And that led to Tyler Uhas coming forward.
My name is Tyler Uhas, and I lived in Neptune at the time, and that's pretty much, the next town over.
Tyler Uhas sees the picture of the Jaguar in the news, and he recognizes that Jaguar, and he becomes concerned about his involvement with that Jaguar.
I moved the vehicle onto Asbury Avenue in Asbury Park. And at that point, I went forward to the prosecutor's office and told them everything I knew.
Tyler Uhas has just arrived at the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office, alleging he has information about a black Jaguar belonging to murder victim Trupel Patel.
Tyler gives a statement to detectives where he says that he moved the car at the behest of Joseph Villani.
I used to be friends with Joey back in 2016, I believe. We became friends. Joey was always in the same parties and same areas I was in, so that's how we became friends.
Joey Villani had 2 older brothers. He lived in Ocean Township with his father. His mother lived in Maryland.
Tyler tells investigators that on the morning of February 8th, 2017, Joey had called him with a favor.
So Joey calls me one day on FaceTime and says to me, "Hey bro, I need you to move my uncle's car to the shop so it can get brakes done." And I'm like, "Well, why can't you move it yourself?"
He needed Tyler's help driving it because Joey could not drive a stick shift car, and the vehicle had to be moved to an auto body shop in Asbury Park.
He says, "Can we just drive it over there tomorrow? I got an appointment." And that's when I said, "Okay, whatever, no big deal, I guess." That next day, he calls me and picks me up from my house. We're on our way to his house. Once we get to his house, I get in the car. So from there, I drive the car to the shop. And as I was parking the car, I saw Joey parking on the adjacent side of the road. I take the keys out of the ignition, I get out of the car, and I go to run inside the shop to hand him the keys, and he yells, they got one, just get in the car and let's go. So I got in the car, and we left. In between that time of us leaving and him going to drop me off, I'm like, this doesn't sound right. None of this sounds right. Like, I just screwed up big time. I just did something wrong.
Tyler says his suspicions were confirmed 2 weeks later.
It's the article about that car. And the picture of the vehicle was of that Jaguar. And that's how I put two and two together. And right from there, I went forward to the prosecutor's office.
Tyler informs investigators that Joey Villani spends most of his time with his girlfriend, Raquel Garajau.
He said Joseph Villani and Raquel Garajau started dating approximately 1 year or more prior to this occurring.
Raquel was, your typical 19-year-old college student. She was smart. She was very vivacious.
She lived with her mother and her older sister. She was attending Brookdale Community College to get her associate's degree. She worked part-time at a law office for an attorney.
Raquel, I met through Joey. She was just a regular girl. I mean, she liked her material things. She loved her makeup, having hair, nails done.
She met Joey Villani towards the end of her high school career.
I remember we were at a party one night, and Joey just runs into her, and then he starts talking to her, and he ends up inviting her back to the house, and ever since then, they were just a couple.
According to Tyler, the relationship between Raquel and Joey had its share of ups and downs.
They would always be happy when they were together and they were doing their own thing, and then, obviously one little thing would happen and there'd be, a huge fight. And then 2-3 seconds later, they would become, A-okay again, and I love you this, I love you that.
Anybody who knew them knew that they had a pretty toxic, sometimes volatile relationship.
Joey and Raquel, they like to have a good time. They'd use drugs, in particular marijuana, and they also dealt in smaller quantities of marijuana amongst their friend circle and other kids that they knew in the area.
Tyler suggests that Joey had developed a sense of competition with Trupal Patel when it came to selling marijuana.
I know Joey used to always say how he wanted to meet Trupal. He would jokingly say that he would wanted to beat him so he could rob him. Joey's friend used to pick up off of Trupal a lot. I believe that's how Joey met Trupal.
Tyler swears that he had no idea he was driving Trupal Patel's car when he helped Joey on February 8th.
The next investigative step would be to really verify Tyler's story.
Detectives asked Tyler if he would agree to make phone calls to Joey Villani that would be recorded by police to see what Joey would say about moving Trupal's car.
I was beyond nervous. All you're thinking about is, am I going to get in trouble for something? Is this it? What the hell? Like, Why me?
2 days after Monmouth County authorities discovered Trupal Patel murdered, Tyler Uhas has just claimed that his friend, 20-year-old Joey Villani, had asked him to move Trupal's car 2 weeks earlier.
Tyler was adamant that he had no information about the homicide of Trupal Patel, that he just moved the car for Joey.
So they asked me to call Joey on the phone on speaker and blatantly straight up tell him that I have the cops at my door about Trupal's car and I need help.
Hello?
Yo, dude, yeah. Bro, the cops are at my house, bro.
You're lying, bro. You're lying.
I'm not lying.
All right, so let's just say, if the cops ask you, did you drive a black or a Jaguar, whatever they say, all right?
Okay.
You say no. You just say no. You say no, bro. Just deny, bro. Deny.
Okay. Okay.
It was clear to law enforcement officers based on the conversation that Joe Villani knew all about the victim's car because he was coaching Tyler Uhas in how to handle the police.
So detectives tell Tyler to set up a meeting with Joey.
All right, meet me at the Monmouth Mall, bro, in front of the movie theater. Head there right now, please.
All right.
All right, go. I'm on my way there.
When Joey arrives, his girlfriend Raquel Garajau is with him.
On February 24th, Joey and Raquel head to the Monmouth Mall, thinking they're meeting up with Tyler Uhas, and instead, Monmouth County detectives are there waiting for them.
Investigators bring both Joey and Raquel back to the Monmouth County Prosecutor's office for questioning.
Go ahead in there.
Make yourself comfortable, pal.
Joey is in one interview room and Raquel is in another. Investigators speak to them separately.
Before Joey's interview officially begins, investigators collect an important piece of evidence from him.
What he had been wearing at the time was a Movado watch. So he did remove the watch and it was placed into an evidence bag. We immediately start reaching out to Tracy, can you please get us a picture of Trupal Patel wearing the watch?
While investigators wait for a response from Trupal's girlfriend, they begin questioning Joey about his relationship to the victim.
Have you ever met Troop before?
No.
Maybe you're at parties together?
Are there mutual? I met him, I did meet him once, but
Okay.
that's it.
About an hour into their interview with Joey, investigators get the proof they need from Trupal's girlfriend, Tracy.
During his interview, I brought out the picture of Trupal Patel wearing the watch.
I noticed that you have a nice watch in your possession there. That's also a very similar, almost, I guess, the same watch that's on Troop.
Could be.
It could be.
Joey continues to stonewall investigators. In the room next door, investigators immediately confront Raquel about Trupal Patel's murder.
What knowledge do you have about Trupal's murder?
Nothing.
About how he was killed?
Nothing. I just know that it was a murder. He got shot in the head from the Asbury Park thing.
Shot in the head from what Asbury Park thing?
Or it was... Yeah, shot. I read it on Facebook. Yeah.
It's something about a gunshot wound to the head. You want to know something? Nobody knows about that.
Investigators continue to pressure Raquel until she finally admits that Joey had confessed to her.
She ultimately says that Joey killed Trupal in self-defense and that it happened in Joey's garage.
What did Joey tell you about that? How did he tell you he killed him? Whose gun did he use to shoot him?
My sister's.
At that point, we were unsure as to her level of involvement. Did she just know about it? Was she involved before, during, after?
Just need you to be truthful. Take a deep breath and tell us what happened.
So Trooper went to Joey's house on Monday. And while I was at work. And they started arguing. It got really physical. Trooper was threatening him. Joey freaked out.
Raquel told detectives that she was at work during the time of the murder.
Did you see his body?
No.
Did you help clean up?
No.
While Joey and Raquel are held in custody, investigators race to the alleged scene of the crime.
The Monmouth County detectives executed a search warrant on the parents' home of Joey Villani.
When they search that residence, they find a .22 caliber Marlin long rifle.
We learned that the murder weapon had been located in the house.
Detectives found shell casings in the garage for a .22 caliber bullet. Detectives were able to collect blood samples from the garage. Those samples were later tested, and it was determined to be Trupal Patel's blood.
With physical evidence tying Joey to the crime, investigators now need a confession.
When it became clear that his story was not matching with the evidence that we had, he, at one point in his interview, kind of throws his hands up and says, "All right, I did it."
I did it. I shot Trooper Patel. Raquel had nothing to do with it. I had told her I had done it, but that's it.
Ultimately, he admitted that he was going to rip him off, and there was some type of altercation. And during the course of that, in self-defense, he tried to protect himself and shot and killed Trupal Patel. Joey stated that Raquel Garajau had nothing to do with it.
Investigators tell Raquel that Joey has come clean.
They were in adjacent rooms, and he was screaming, "I love you" to her. She was being interviewed next door.
Raquel, I know you can hear me.
We never stop loving you. You know what for the day that I got this. I promise. Raquel. It's okay.
Such an idiot.
I'm here for you.
Joseph Villani was ultimately arrested and charged with the death of Trupal Patel. After questioning Raquel Garajau, she was released and was not charged.
Why don't you come with us?
We didn't have really any other evidence to show that she was involved.
In order to clear Raquel of any wrongdoing, investigators need to corroborate her story.
Before Raquel left the prosecutor's office that night, she had given consent to search her cell phone. It's really unclear how much she knows at that point. So that was one of the first things that we started doing, was going through her cell phone. She had deleted all of her text messages with Joey, and we were able to recover those.
Authorities discover that leading up to Trupal's murder, Raquel had sent Joey an incriminating text.
On January 19th, Joey texted Raquel that the rifle works and that he's got the bullets. A few days later, I think it was on February 2nd, Raquel sends a text message to Joey, "You need to clean the bullets." She was instructing him to wipe the bullets down, thinking he would leave fingerprints on them.
Following Trupal's death, Raquel sent more damning texts to Joey.
She was just telling Joey to kind of like how to deal with it, like clean up, bleach everything. Like it was just very cold. No remorse was found in any of their text messages. In addition to the text messages of the cell phone records, the cell phone location records really build our case against Raquel.
What we did determine using her cell phone, she was in the area of Joey's house. She did not go to work that day.
We realized she was lying about multiple things.
So at that point, a determination was made to go to the grand jury and get an indictment for Raquel.
Monmouth County investigators have discovered evidence that suggests 20-year-old Joey Villani and his girlfriend, 19-year-old Raquel Garajau, had plotted the murder of Trupal Patel together.
On May 15, 2017, so about 3 months after Joey is arrested, Raquel is arrested and charged with the same crime. She's charged with felony murder, armed robbery, conspiracy, and other related offenses. We had Trupal's blood in Joey's garage. We had Trupal's blood in Joey's car. We had the murder weapon in Joey's house. So we had a really strong case against Joey Villani. Not the same with Raquel, though. The case against her was very circumstantial.
On July 17, 2018, the trial of Raquel Garajau begins in Monmouth County, New Jersey.
She was a young girl who had a lot to go for in her life and got hooked up with the wrong guy.
It was a toxic relationship, and Joey wanted to make her happy. And Raquel wanted certain things to be happy. She wanted money, she wanted nice things, and at the time, Joey had $1.31 in his bank account, and Trupal was somebody that they realized that they could target. You know, he wasn't a violent guy. The evidence shows that on February 6th, Trupal Patel left Monroe Towers at about 3:30 and drove to Joey Villani's house in Ocean Township.
Trupal is going to Joey's house to just make another drug sale. He walks into Joey's garage. Joey has a .22 caliber long rifle, like a hunting rifle, and Joey shoots Trupal 3 times, twice in the head, once in the chest.
This was not a self-defense case. The medical examiner concluded that Trupal Patel was not shot at close range. He was shot from further away.
Cell phone records show Raquel in close proximity, going back to Joey's house shortly after.
Then Raquel searches how to drive a stick shift at 4:23 p.m., which is probably only, minutes after Trupal is murdered. So we believed that when he realized the car was a stick shift, they had to go to Plan B at that point and reach out to Tyler.
Prosecutors argue the couple took Trupal's money and went shopping.
Trupal Patel made a lot of money selling marijuana. He was also known to carry large amounts of cash on his person.
We believe Joey takes all of Trupal's marijuana, his cash, his Movado watch. We put the ballpark of the cash around maybe $2,000.
They go to the mall, to Pandora, and Joey buys Raquel a promise ring that she's been asking him for in cash for $400.
They're buying Raquel a ring. They're an ordinary couple just ring shopping while Trupal's lying dead in the garage.
We believe that Trupal's body was in Joey Villani's garage from about the time of the homicide, which we put at about 4 o'clock on February 6th, until sometime later that night into the early hours of the following morning.
The defense asserts Raquel's only offense was falling for Joey Villani.
There was no physical evidence, no statements from anyone connecting Raquel Garajau to Patel's death. And as a matter of fact, her co-defendant now, Joseph Villani, had indicated Raquel Garajau had nothing to do with the death of Trupal Patel. Make sure you clean the bullets. was the text that was most problematic in the case because it occurred 3 days before the death of Trupel Patel.
After a 10-week trial, jury deliberations get underway on September 12, 2018.
The jury ultimately found Raquel guilty on all of the counts against her.
Ultimately, in January of 2019, she is sentenced to 33 years with a mandatory period of 30 years before she's eligible for parole.
After Raquel was convicted, Joey pleads guilty to a charge of aggravated manslaughter and desecration of human remains for disposing of Trupel's body, and the judge ultimately sentences him to 40 years in prison. They're where they deserve to be. You know, she probably wouldn't have pulled the trigger herself, but Joey would never have done this without Raquel.
Love can make people do a lot of crazy things. Love can make people do anything that they put their mind to over it.
I want the world to remember Trupel for his heart and for his generosity and the fun person that would just always be there if you needed him. I want him to be remembered for being a great friend in every aspect, and he will be missed.
In the early hours of a quiet spring morning in Queensland, there was nothing to suggest that anything had gone wrong. The streets were still, the routines familiar, the world moving forward in that quiet, predictable way that makes people believe they are safe. Somewhere in that stillness, a 12-year-old girl was supposed to be getting ready for school. She had a name, a routine, a place she was expected to be. Her name was Tylee Palmer. And according to the only person who claimed to have seen her that morning, everything had unfolded exactly as it should have. She had been dropped off at school. She had walked away like any other child. She had simply disappeared. But disappearances rarely begin where we think they do. They don't start the moment someone is reported missing. They begin earlier, quietly, invisibly, behind closed doors, inside ordinary homes. In the spaces where trust is assumed and questions are rarely asked. Because the truth is, by the time anyone began searching for Tylee Palmer, by the time her name was spoken with urgency and fear, she was already gone. Not missing, not lost, gone. 6 days later, along the edge of Pimpama River, a discovery would force that quiet morning into something far darker. A body, partially concealed by water and time, was found by chance. There was no immediate recognition, no clear identity, only the unmistakable weight of something tragic. It would take another day before authorities confirmed what many had already begun to fear, that the child who had supposedly walked into school had never arrived at all, that she had never even made it out of her own home alive. And that realization changed everything. Because when a child disappears on the way to school, the world looks outward. It searches for strangers, for unknown dangers lurking in unexpected places. But when the truth begins at home, the direction of every question shifts. The timeline fractures. The assumptions collapse. And the most terrifying possibility begins to take shape. Not that something random had happened, but that something deliberate had already been set in motion long before anyone noticed. The story that followed would not be one of sudden crime, but of a carefully constructed illusion. A story built on routine, on repetition, on the simple, unquestioned act of a parent saying, "I drop her off." It was a statement so ordinary, so unremarkable, that no one thought to challenge it at first. Why would they? This was a child in care, placed into a home that had been approved, monitored, trusted. A home that was supposed to represent safety, stability, protection. A home where nothing like this was supposed to happen. And yet, as investigators would eventually uncover, that statement, the last claimed sighting of Tylee Palmer, was not a memory. It was a lie that bought time, a lie that redirected suspicion, a lie that allowed a different story to take hold, one where a child simply vanished somewhere between a driveway and a classroom. But the truth does not disappear so easily. It lingers in the gaps, in the inconsistencies, in the things that don't quite align. It waits in the silence between what is said and what actually happened. And in this case, the silence was everywhere. It was in the missing footage that never showed her arriving at school. It was in the absence of witnesses who had seen her that morning. It was in the small details that, taken alone, meant nothing, but together began to form something impossible to ignore. Because if she never made it to school, then where had she been? And more importantly, who had been the last person to see her alive? These are the questions that unravel stories like this. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, piece by piece, until the version of events that once seemed certain begins to collapse under its own weight. And as that process begins, as investigators turn their attention inward instead of outward, the narrative shifts from a search to something else entirely. Something heavier, something far more disturbing. Because this is not just the story of a missing child. It is the story of what happens when the place meant to protect becomes the place where the danger begins. It is the story of how easily truth can be buried beneath routine, beneath familiarity, beneath the quiet assumption that what we are told must be real. And above all, it is the story of a girl who trusted the people around her because she was supposed to. In the days that followed her disappearance, there would be searches, interviews, public appeals, and growing concern. There would be a community looking for answers, holding on to the belief that she might still be found. But beneath all of that, beneath the surface of the investigation, something else was already taking shape. A different timeline, a different sequence of events. One that did not begin on a school route or end in a random act of violence, but instead traced back to a single location, a house where nothing seemed out of place. And yet everything already was. And when that truth finally surfaced, it would force a confrontation with something far more unsettling than a stranger in the dark. It would reveal that the danger had never been unknown. It had been familiar. It had been trusted. It had been there all along. This is the story of Tylee Palmer. Not just how she died, but how the truth of what happened to her was hidden in plain sight. Not just a case of disappearance, but a case of silence, prolonged, deliberate, and devastating. Because sometimes the most dangerous lies are not the ones that sound suspicious, but the ones that sound exactly the way we expect them to. To understand what happened to Tylee Palmer, you have to begin long before the morning she was reported missing, long before the search began, long before anyone questioned the story they had been told. You have to begin with who she was and the world she had been placed into. Tylee was born in 2003, a child whose early life led her into the foster care system, a system designed to provide stability where there had been disruption, to offer safety where there had been uncertainty. For children like her, placement into a foster home is supposed to mean something very specific, that the adults around them have been vetted, approved, and entrusted with a responsibility that is both legal and deeply human. It means that the home they enter is not just another place to stay, but a place where they are meant to be protected. In 2011, at just 8 years old, Tylee was placed with the Thorburn family in Chambers Flat, a semi-rural area near Logan in Queensland. On paper, it was the kind of placement that fit the system's expectations. The household had been assessed. It had met the criteria required to care for a child. And for years, that was the environment in which Tylee lived, grew, and navigated her adolescence. At the center of that household was Rick Thorburn, the man who would come to be known not as her guardian, but as her killer. Around him was a family structure that, from the outside, appeared ordinary, routine, functional, unremarkable. There were other children in the home, including his biological sons, among them Trent Thorburn. Together, they formed the environment that the system had approved, the environment that was supposed to replace instability with safety. But environments are not defined by appearances. They're defined by what happens inside them, by the dynamics that are often invisible to those looking in from the outside. And in this case, what was happening inside that home was something no system had prevented, and no outward sign had fully revealed. At some point during her time in that household, Tylee was subjected to sexual abuse by Trent Thorburn. This is not speculation or inference. It is a fact established during the investigation that followed her death, one that would later result in his conviction for incest. It is a detail that fundamentally reshapes how the entire case is understood, because it introduces not just violence but motive. It reveals that within the walls of that house, there is already a crime being committed, one that depended on silence, on concealment, on the absence of intervention. For a child in foster care, the ability to speak up is often complicated by fear, by uncertainty, by the fragile nature of their placement. Reporting abuse can mean upheaval, removal, the loss of what little stability they have. And in situations where that abuse is hidden, where it is not immediately visible to those responsible for oversight, it can continue unchecked. In Tylee's case, the abuse did not remain hidden forever. It became a risk, a threat, not to her, but to the people responsible for it. Because once the possibility of exposure enters the equation, once there is a chance that the truth could come out, the dynamics shift. What had been concealed becomes dangerous. What had been ignored becomes urgent. And according to the conclusions presented by the prosecution, that shift is what set the stage for what would happen next. The fear was not abstract. It was specific. There was concern that the abuse would be discovered. There was fear that Tylee might be pregnant. And there was the looming reality of legal consequences, charges, loss of custody. The collapse of the very structure that had allowed the situation to exist in the first place. These are not assumptions layered onto the story after the fact. They are the framework through which investigators and prosecutors understood the motive behind the crime. And when viewed through that lens, the events that followed are no longer random or impulsive. They become calculated, preventative, designed to stop something from being revealed. This is where the story shifts from one of hidden abuse to one of escalating danger. Because once a person becomes a risk to be managed rather than a child to be protected, the logic changes. The priorities change. The boundaries that should never be crossed begin to erode. And in that environment, the unthinkable becomes possible. It is important to understand that none of this was visible in the way people expect danger to be. Visible. There were no dramatic warning signs that triggered immediate intervention. There was no single moment that publicly signaled what was happening behind closed doors. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of risk, of secrecy, of decisions made in private that would only later be understood in their full context. For years, Tylee lived within that system, within that household, within that structure of trust that was supposed to protect her. And for years, that trust held, at least on the surface. But trust, when misplaced, does not fail loudly. It fails quietly, in ways that are only recognized after the damage has already been done. By the time the abuse became a factor in the investigation, by the time its implications were fully understood, it was already too late to prevent what had happened. What remained was the question of how far those implications had gone, how deeply they had influenced the actions of the people involved, and how directly they had led to the events of October 2015. Because when a crime is committed to conceal another crime, the two cannot be separated. They are part of the same sequence, the same chain of cause and effect. And in this case, that chain leads directly from abuse to fear, from fear to decision, and from decision to violence. The home that Tylee had been placed into was supposed to represent a second chance, a safe environment in which she could grow and be cared for. Instead, it became the setting for a series of events that would end her life. And that is the context in which everything that follows must be understood, not as an isolated act, not as a sudden loss of control, but as the outcome of a situation that had been building unseen within the very place that was meant to keep her safe. The events of October 29th, 2015, did not begin with anything that would have immediately signaled what was about to happen. There was no public disruption, no visible fracture in routine, nothing that would have drawn attention from the outside. Inside the home in Chambers Flat, in Queensland, the evening unfolded behind closed doors, in a space that had long been defined by its apparent normalcy. And yet, within that ordinary setting, the final hours of Tyale Palmer's life were already taking shape, confined to a narrow window of time that investigators would later reconstruct with care but could never fully witness. According to the established timeline, Tyale was at home that evening, and she was there with Rick Thorburn. The significance of that detail would only become clear later, but in that moment, it was simply part of the routine, another night in a house where she had lived for years. Between approximately 7:30 p.m. and 9:30 p.m., something happened within that home that ended her life. There are no recorded witnesses to the act itself, no direct account of the moments as they unfolded, only the conclusions drawn from forensic analysis and the broader investigation. What those conclusions establish is stark and unambiguous. Tyale died that night, and her death was not natural. The precise mechanism could not be definitively determined due to the condition of her body when it was later recovered. But forensic experts concluded that she died from asphyxiation, either strangulation or another form of deliberate suffocation. It is a form of death that requires proximity, control, and time. It is not instantaneous, and it does not occur without intent. That reality, even in the absence of a detailed account, defines the nature of what happened in that house. At some point within that 2-hour window, Tyale's life was taken, and the person responsible remained in the same space, with the immediate aftermath unfolding not in chaos, but in silence. What followed is not described through speculation, but through what is known after her death. Her body was not immediately removed. Instead, it remained in the house overnight. This detail is critical, not because it fills in every gap, but because it establishes a sequence of decisions. The act itself was followed not by panic or surrender, but by a pause, an interval in which the reality of what had happened coexisted with the opportunity to choose what would come next. And what came next was not the reporting of a death, not an attempt to seek help, but the beginning of concealment. The decision to keep her body in the house overnight indicates planning, or at the very least, the absence of immediate accountability. It suggests that the events of that night were not treated as an irreversible tragedy to be confronted, but as a situation to be managed. By the time the night gave way to early morning, that management had taken a more concrete form. In the early hours of October 30th, before the routines of the day began, Tyale's body was placed into a vehicle. From there, it was transported approximately 30 kilometers away from the home, toward the area surrounding Pimpama River. The distance itself is significant, not random, but sufficient to separate the location of death from the place where the body would eventually be found. When the vehicle reached the river, her body was disposed of there, left in an environment where water, time, and natural processes would begin to alter its condition. This act was not incidental. It served a clear purpose: to delay identification, to obscure evidence, to create distance not just physically, but narratively. By placing her body in the river, the scene of the crime was effectively relocated, transformed into something less defined, less traceable. The home where she had died no longer contained the most immediate evidence of what had happened. Instead, the investigation, when it began, would be forced to start elsewhere, to piece together a story from fragments rather than from a single contained location. And as the morning progressed, the final stage of that initial sequence was set into motion, not at the river, but back at the house. Because the concealment of a body is only one part of hiding a crime. The other is constructing a version of events that explains the absence. Later that morning, the narrative was established. Tyale had been taken to school. It was a simple claim, one that aligned with routine, one that required no immediate proof because it fit within expectations. Children are dropped off at school every day. They walk through gates into classrooms, into spaces where they blend into the larger rhythm of daily life. It is a transition so common that it is rarely scrutinized in real time. And that is precisely what made it effective as a cover. According to this account, nothing unusual had happened. There was no mention of the previous night, no indication that anything had disrupted the expected sequence of events. Instead, the story began at a point where everything still appeared normal. But what makes this moment so critical is not just the claim itself, but the contrast between what was said and what had already occurred. Because by the time those words were spoken, Tyale was no longer alive. By the time the narrative of a school drop-off was introduced, her body had already been transported and left in a river miles away. The timeline that was presented to others began after the actual timeline had already ended. And that disconnect, the gap between reality and representation, is what defines the incident as a whole. It was not just an act of violence, but the immediate transformation of that act into something hidden, something disguised as ordinary absence rather than deliberate harm. The night of October 29th and the early hours of October 30th form a continuous sequence, one that moves from life to death, from death to concealment, and from concealment to fabrication. Each step follows the last with a kind of internal logic, a progression that replaces truth with a constructed alternative. And at the center of that sequence is a child whose final moments were never witnessed, whose voice was never heard, and whose disappearance was not the result of chance, but of a series of deliberate actions taken in a place where she should have been safe. When a child is reported missing, the first hours of an investigation are often defined by urgency and uncertainty, a race against time guided by the assumption that the truth is still unfolding somewhere out in the world. In the case of Tyale Palmer, that urgency began with a story that seemed simple, almost routine. She had been dropped off at school and never arrived. It was a version of events that immediately shaped the direction of the search, pushing attention outward toward roads, pathways, strangers, and the countless possibilities that exist between home and a destination. But what investigators did not yet know was that this story had already been constructed on top of something else, something that had taken place hours earlier and far closer to home. The morning of October 30th, 2015, unfolded under that assumption. Rick Thorburn stated that he had driven Tyale to school, placing her last known movements firmly within a familiar routine. At first, there was no immediate reason to doubt this account. It fit expectations. It aligned with what families do every day. But investigations are built not only on what is said, but on what can be verified. And it was in that verification process that the first fractures began to appear. One of the earliest steps taken by investigators was to establish a timeline using available surveillance and witness accounts. Schools, particularly those in populated areas of Queensland, are environments where movement is often observed, if not formally recorded. Students arrive, staff notice absences, and patterns become visible quickly. In Tyale's case, those patterns did not align with the story that had been given. There was no confirmation that she had entered the school grounds. No teacher reported seeing her. No student recalled her presence that morning. And critically, no available camera footage captured her arrival. Individually, any one of these absences might have been explained. Together, They form a gap that could not be easily ignored. If she had been dropped off, where was the evidence of that moment? As investigators continued to examine the details, additional inconsistencies emerged. Items that should have accompanied her, her school bag, her uniform, were not accounted for in a way that matched the narrative. These were not dramatic clues, not the kind that immediately point to a single conclusion, but they added weight to a growing sense that the initial account was incomplete, or possibly untrue. At the same time, attention began to shift toward the household itself. In many missing person cases, the last known location becomes a focal point, and for Tyale, that location was her home. Investigators began to look more closely at the timeline provided by the family, comparing statements, identifying overlaps, and noting where accounts diverged. What they found was not a single, cohesive story, but a series of details that did not fully align. There were inconsistencies in how the morning had been described, in the sequence of events, in the specifics that should have remained constant if the account were accurate. These inconsistencies did not immediately reveal what had happened, but they raised a crucial question if the story was not entirely reliable. What part of it could be trusted? As the days passed, the investigation expanded. Resources were mobilized, and more than 50 investigators became involved, each contributing to the process of reconstructing what had occurred. Searches were conducted, appeals were made, and the case remained, at least publicly, one a missing child. But internally, the focus was beginning to narrow. The absence of evidence supporting the school drop-off, combined with the inconsistencies in the family's account, shifted attention back to where the story had begun. Then, on November 5th, 2015, a development changed the nature of the case entirely. Along the edge of Pimpama River, a body was discovered. It was found by chance, not as the direct result of a targeted search, and its condition reflected the passage of time and exposure to the environment. At that moment, there was no immediate confirmation of identity, only the recognition that what had been a search for a missing person might now be something else. The following day, that uncertainty was resolved. The body was identified as Tyale Palmer. With that confirmation, the case shifted from a disappearance to a homicide investigation. The timeline that investigators had been attempting to build now had a definitive endpoint, and the focus moved from finding her to understanding how she had died and who was responsible. The discovery of her body also introduced new challenges. Due to the level of decomposition, determining the exact cause of death was not straightforward. However, forensic analysis ultimately concluded that she had died from asphyxiation, consistent with either strangulation or another form of deliberate suffocation. This finding aligned with the growing suspicion that her death had not occurred outside the home, but within it, and that the narrative of her last movements had been deliberately altered. With this information, the investigation entered a more focused phase. The question was no longer where Tyale had gone, but how the events described by her family could be reconciled with the evidence. And increasingly, they could not. The lack of corroboration for the school drop-off, the inconsistencies in statements, and the forensic findings all pointed in the same direction. The truth did not lie somewhere between home and school. It lay within the home itself. As investigators continued to examine the case, the Thorburn family became the central focus. This was not an immediate conclusion, but the result of a process in which alternative explanations were gradually eliminated. If she had not been seen at school, if there was no evidence of her traveling there, and if the account of her last known movements could not be substantiated, then the timeline had to be reconsidered. And in that revised timeline, the last confirmed location where she had been alive was the place she lived. Over time, the investigation also uncovered evidence that pointed to deliberate deception. Statements that had been given early on were found to be inconsistent with later findings. Details that should have remained stable changed under scrutiny. And the pattern that emerged was not one of confusion, but of concealment. It became increasingly clear that the initial narrative had not been an attempt to describe what had happened, but an attempt to redirect attention away from it. This realization marked a turning point. What had begun as a search for a missing child had evolved into a case centered on the actions of those closest to her. The focus was no longer on external threats, but on internal ones, on the dynamics within the household, on the decisions made in the hours following her death, and on the reasons those decisions had been made. By the time investigators reached this stage, the structure of the case had fundamentally changed. The pieces that had once seemed disconnected, the missing footage, the inconsistent statements, the unexplained absence, had begun to align. They formed a pattern that pointed not outward, but inward, toward a version of events that had been hidden behind a carefully constructed story. And as that pattern became clearer, so too did the path forward for the investigation. It was no longer about finding Tylee Palmer. It was about uncovering the truth of what had been done to her, and holding accountable the people who had tried to ensure that truth would never be known. By the time the investigation had shifted fully from a missing persons case to a homicide inquiry, the foundation had already been laid through weeks and months of careful reconstruction, contradiction analysis, and the gradual dismantling of the original narrative. The focus had narrowed, the timeline had been redefined, and the inconsistencies that once raised questions had begun to point in a single, unavoidable direction. In 2016, that direction led to the arrest of Rick Thorburn, the man who had initially positioned himself as the last person to see Tylee Palmer alive on the morning she was said to have gone to school. His arrest marked a critical turning point, not because it immediately answered every question, but because it formalized what the investigation had already begun to establish, that the truth of Tylee's death was rooted within the home, not outside it. From that moment forward, the case moved toward the legal arena, where the focus would shift from investigation to proof, from suspicion to accountability. The process that followed was not immediate. Cases of this nature, particularly those built on circumstantial timelines and forensic reconstruction rather than direct eyewitness testimony, require time to assemble into a coherent legal argument. Each element, the timeline discrepancies, the absence of corroborating evidence for the school drop-off, the forensic conclusion of asphyxiation, the disposal of the body at Pimpama River, had to be presented not as isolated facts, but as interconnected components of a single narrative that demonstrated intent, action, and concealment. In 2018, that process reached a decisive moment when Rick Thorburn entered a plea of guilty to the charge of murder in the Supreme Court of Queensland. A guilty plea, in many cases, can bring a sense of resolution, a clear acknowledgement of responsibility that eliminates the need for a prolonged trial. But in this case, the plea did not fully resolve the underlying tension between what had been done and how it was being explained. Because alongside the admission of guilt came a statement that attempted to frame the nature of the act itself. Rick Thorburn claimed that Tylee's death may have been the result of accidental suffocation, suggesting that what had occurred was not a deliberate act of killing, but an unintended consequence of some other action. This claim introduced a critical point of contention. In legal terms, the distinction between intentional murder and accidental death is profound, affecting not only the classification of the crime, but also the interpretation of every action that followed. However, the weight of the evidence did not support this characterization. Prosecutors, drawing on the findings of the investigation and the forensic analysis, rejected the notion that Tylee's death had been accidental. The conclusion that she died from asphyxiation was not, in itself, enough to establish intent. But when considered alongside the broader context, the prior abuse within the household, the immediate concealment of her body, the transportation and disposal of that body, and the fabrication of a false narrative about her whereabouts. The argument for accident became increasingly untenable. Intent, in this case, was not inferred from a single moment, but from a sequence of actions that followed the death. If the death had been accidental, there would have been opportunities to seek help, to report what had happened, to allow the situation to be addressed through legal and medical channels. Instead, what occurred was the opposite. The body was kept overnight, transported in secrecy, and disposed of in a location chosen to delay discovery. A false story was then constructed to explain her absence, redirecting attention away from the home and toward an imagined disappearance. These actions, taken together, formed a pattern that was inconsistent with accident and aligned far more closely with deliberate concealment of a crime. The court ultimately accepted this reasoning. Rick Thorburn was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, a penalty that reflects the gravity of the offense and the conclusion that the act was intentional. The sentence also carried a broader implication, that the legal system recognized not only the loss of Tylea's life, but the calculated efforts that followed to obscure the truth of that loss. Beyond Rick Thorburns' conviction, the legal proceedings also addressed the role of other members of the household. During the investigation, it became clear that there had been attempts to mislead authorities, to provide statements that did not align with the evidence, and to withhold information that could have clarified the timeline sooner. These actions, while distinct from the act of murder itself, were not without consequence. Charges related to obstructing justice and concealing information were brought against members of the family, reflecting the understanding that the concealment of a crime is itself a serious offense, one that compounds the harm already done. The courtroom phase of the case, while shorter than a full trial might have been due to the guilty plea, still served as a space where the narrative of the investigation was formalized into a legal record. It was where the fragmented pieces of evidence, timelines, forensic findings, inconsistencies were assembled into a coherent account of what had occurred. And it was where the attempt to reframe the act as accidental was examined and ultimately rejected. In many ways, the plea and sentencing brought a procedural end to the case. There was a conviction, a sentence, and a formal acknowledgement of responsibility. But resolution, in the deeper sense, is more complex. A guilty plea can confirm what happened, but it does not restore what was lost, nor does it fully answer every question about why those events unfolded as they did. What it does provide is a definitive conclusion within the framework of the law, that Tylea Palmer was killed, that the act was intentional, and that the person responsible would be held accountable for the remainder of his life. The legal outcome also reinforced a broader truth about the case, that the actions taken after Tylea's death were not peripheral, but central to understanding its nature. The concealment, the deception, the attempt to redirect the narrative. These were not separate from the crime, but part of it. They demonstrated an awareness of wrongdoing and a deliberate effort to avoid its consequences. And in doing so, they provided the court with the context needed to interpret the act not as an accident, but as a calculated decision made within a sequence of escalating actions. In the end, the courtroom did what it is designed to do. It examined the evidence, weighed the competing explanations, and arrived at a conclusion based on the totality of what could be proven. That conclusion was clear, even if the path to it had been complex. Rick Thorburn was guilty of murder, and the attempt to present the death as anything less than intentional did not withstand scrutiny. What remained beyond the legal findings was the recognition that this case was never just about a single moment of violence, but about everything that surrounded it, the conditions that led to it, the actions that followed it, and the effort to ensure that it remained hidden for as long as possible. In the aftermath of the conviction, When the legal process had reached its formal conclusion and the sentence had been delivered, what remained was not closure in the way it is often imagined, but a lingering weight carried by the details of what had happened and the questions it left behind. The case of Tyler Palmer did not end with the sentencing of Rick Thorburn. It extended outward into public consciousness, into institutional reflection, and into a broader examination of how a system designed to protect a child had failed in ways that were both profound and preventable. At the center of that reflection was the most difficult truth of all, that the person responsible for Tylea's death was not a stranger, not an unknown threat encountered by chance, but the very individual entrusted with her care. This fact alone reshaped the narrative from one of isolated violence to one of systemic vulnerability, where trust had been placed in a structure that ultimately did not safeguard the child within it. The details of the case continued to resonate, not because they were sensational, but because they revealed a pattern of actions that, when considered together, were deeply unsettling. The deliberate construction of a false narrative, the claim that she had been dropped off at school, the participation in search efforts that were based on that false premise, and the act of carrying her coffin during the funeral, these were not separate moments, but interconnected expressions of concealment, each one reinforcing the distance between what had been done and what was being presented to the world. For many, it was this contrast that lingered most strongly. The image of a grieving caregiver on the surface, and the reality of a perpetrator beneath it. It is a dissonance that challenges assumptions about how guilt should appear, how grief should manifest, and how easily appearances can be mistaken for truth. Beyond the actions of individuals, the case also forced a closer look at the system that had placed Tyler in that environment. The foster care system exists to provide stability and safety for children who cannot remain in their biological homes, relying on a network of assessments, approvals, and ongoing oversight to ensure that placements are appropriate. In this case, those mechanisms had functioned in a way that allowed Tyler to remain in a household where harm was occurring. The reasons for that failure are complex and cannot be reduced to a single point of breakdown. But the outcome is clear: a child who should have been protected was not. In the wake of the case, authorities in Queensland were compelled to re-examine the processes by which foster homes are evaluated and monitored, with particular attention to how risks are identified and addressed over time. The goal of such reflection is not only to understand what went wrong, but to prevent similar failures in the future. Yet prevention is always shaped by the limitations of what can be seen, what can be reported, and what can be acted upon before harm escalates beyond control. One of the most challenging aspects of cases like this is that the critical factors, abuse, fear of exposure, the internal dynamics of a household, often exist in spaces that are difficult for systems to access directly. They rely on disclosure, on observation, on intervention at the right moment. When those elements do not align, the system can continue to function on the assumption that all is well, even when it is not. The story of Tyler Palmer underscores that gap between assumption and reality, between what is believed and what is true. It highlights the limitations of oversight when faced with deliberate concealment, and the consequences of those limitations when they intersect with vulnerability. At the same time, the case serves as a reminder that accountability, while essential, is only one part of a broader response. The conviction of Rick Thorburn established legal responsibility, and the charges brought against other family members addressed the role of deception and obstruction. But the impact of the case extends beyond the courtroom, into the ways communities think about trust, about care, and about the unseen risks that can exist within environments that appear safe. It raises questions that do not have simple answers. How can systems better detect hidden harm? How can children be supported in ways that make disclosure possible? And how can accountability be balanced with prevention in a way that truly reduces risk? These are questions that remain open, shaped by each case that brings them into focus. For Tyale, those questions are part of the legacy she leaves behind, not by choice, but by the circumstances of what happened to her. Her story is not defined solely by the manner of her death, but by the context in which it occurred and the response it generated. It is a story that resists simplification because it is not only about a crime, but about the conditions that allowed that crime to take place and the efforts required to ensure that those conditions are recognized and addressed elsewhere. In reflecting on this case, it is important to return to the central figure within it, not the perpetrator, not the system, but the child whose life was lost. Tyale Palmer was placed into a home with the expectation of safety, and that expectation was not met. Everything that followed, the investigation, the trial, the reforms, exists in the shadow of that failure. And while those responses are necessary, they do not change the fundamental outcome. What they can do, however, is shape the future, influencing how similar situations are identified and addressed before they reach the same point. The final reflection, then, is not one of resolution, but of responsibility. Responsibility to examine what happened without distortion, to acknowledge the gaps that were exposed, and to consider how those gaps can be closed. Responsibility to recognize that safety is not guaranteed by structure alone, but must be continuously supported by vigilance, transparency, and the willingness to act when something is not right. And above all, responsibility to remember that behind every case like this is a person whose life mattered, whose absence is not an abstraction, but a reality that continues long after the legal process has ended. Tyale Palmer did not simply disappear, and her story does not end with a verdict. It remains as a reminder, quiet but persistent, of what can happen when trust is misplaced, when warning signs go unseen, and when silence is allowed to take the place of truth. What remains? After everything that can be documented has been said and every legal conclusion has been reached, is the part of the story that does not exist in evidence files or courtroom transcripts, but in the space where memory, impact, and meaning intersect. The case of Tyale Palmer lingers not because it is complex in its outcome. There was a conviction, a sentence, a clear determination of guilt, but because of what it reveals about the quiet intersections between trust and vulnerability, between systems and the individuals they are meant to protect. It is easy, in the aftermath of a case like this, to focus on the sequence of events, the timeline, the inconsistencies, the investigation, the legal process. Those elements provide structure, a way to understand what happened in a linear, comprehensible form. But what they cannot fully capture is the human dimension that exists beyond those facts, the lived experience of a child who depended on the people around her, and the absence that follows when that dependency is betrayed. There is a tendency, particularly in stories that involve deception, to search for a moment where everything could have been different, a point at which intervention might have changed the outcome. In this case, that point is not singular. It is distributed across time, across decisions, across missed opportunities for recognition and response. The abuse that was later uncovered did not begin on the day of the murder, and the fear that motivated the concealment did not emerge in isolation. These were elements that developed within an environment that, from the outside, appeared stable enough to pass inspection. That contrast between appearance and reality is one of the most enduring aspects of the case. It challenges the assumption that risk is always visible, that danger announces itself in ways that can be easily identified and addressed. In reality, as this case demonstrates, harm can exist in forms that are deliberately hidden, sustained by silence, and protected by the very structures that are meant to prevent it. The foster care system, as it functioned in this instance within Queensland, was built on a framework of trust. That trust is necessary. Without it, the system cannot operate. But trust without sufficient verification, without ongoing scrutiny that adapts to changing circumstances, creates a space where harm can persist undetected. The response to this case has included efforts to strengthen oversight, to refine the processes by which foster placements are monitored, and to ensure that warning signs, when they do appear, are recognized and acted upon more effectively. These are important steps, but they exist within the broader reality that no system can eliminate risk entirely. What it can do is reduce the likelihood of harm and increase the chances that it will be identified before it escalates. Another dimension of the case that continues to resonate is the role of silence, not just as the absence of speech, but as a condition that allows certain dynamics to continue unchallenged. Silence can take many forms. The silence of a victim who does not feel able to disclose. The silence of a household that conceals its internal reality. The silence of a system that does not detect what it cannot see. In this case, silence was not passive. It was active, maintained through deception, through the construction of a false narrative, through the deliberate redirection of attention away from the truth. Breaking that silence required time, investigation, and the accumulation of evidence that could not be ignored. But by the time it was broken, the harm had already been done. This is one of the most difficult aspects of cases like this. The recognition that understanding often comes too late to prevent the outcome it seeks to explain. And yet, that understanding remains essential, not because it can change what has happened, but because it informs what happens next. It shapes how similar cases are approached, how warning signs are interpreted, how systems evolve in response to their own limitations. The story of Tylee Palmer is, in this sense, both specific and universal. It is specific in its details, in the sequence of events that led to her death, in the individuals involved. But it is also universal in what it represents, the vulnerability of children who depend on others for their safety, the challenges inherent in protecting that safety, and the consequences when those challenges are not fully met. It is a story that resists closure because its implications extend beyond the boundaries of the case itself. Even after the legal process has concluded, even after the sentence has been imposed, the questions it raises continue to exist. How do we ensure that trust is warranted? How do we create systems that are not only reactive, but proactive in identifying risk? How do we support those who are most vulnerable in ways that make it possible for them to be heard? These are not questions with simple answers, but they are questions that must be asked repeatedly, in different contexts, with a willingness to adapt based on what is learned. In returning to the central figure of the case, it is important to resist the tendency to let the narrative be dominated by the actions of the perpetrator. The focus, instead, belongs with Tylee Palmer, with the life that was lived, however briefly, and the absence that remains. Her story is not defined solely by the circumstances of her death, but by the fact that she existed within a system that was meant to protect her, and that protection was not realized. Remembering that is not about assigning blame in a general sense, but about maintaining clarity regarding what is at stake when systems fail, when trust is misplaced, when silence is allowed to persist. In the end, there is no resolution that can fully reconcile what has happened. There is only the ongoing process of acknowledgement, reflection, and change. The case does not conclude in a way that restores balance. It concludes with a recognition of loss, and with the responsibility to carry forward the lessons it provides. That responsibility belongs not only to institutions, but to communities, to individuals, to anyone who participates in the structures that shape how care is given and how safety is maintained. Because while the events of October 2015 are fixed in time, the conditions that allowed them to occur are not. They can be examined, challenged, and altered. And in that possibility, however limited, There's a form of meaning that extends beyond the case itself, not as a resolution, but as a commitment to ensure that the silence that surrounded Tyler Palmer is not repeated elsewhere, and that the trust placed in systems of care is met with the vigilance required to make that trust real. In telling the story of Tyler Palmer from beginning to end, there comes a final moment where the facts have all been laid out, where the timeline has been reconstructed, where responsibility has been assigned, and yet something essential still remains unresolved, not in a legal sense, but in a human one. Because cases like this do not end when the court proceedings conclude or when the sentence is delivered. They end, if they ever truly do, in the way they are remembered, in the way they shape the thinking of those who hear them, and in the quiet recognition that what happened was not inevitable, but the result of a series of conditions that aligned in the worst possible way. What makes this case so enduring is not just the tragedy of a life lost, but the nature of the environment in which that loss occurred. Tyler Palmer was not alone in an unfamiliar place, not exposed to a random act of violence that could not have been anticipated. She was in a home, a place defined by its promise of safety, surrounded by people who had been entrusted with her care. That distinction matters because it shifts the focus from unpredictability to responsibility, from chance to structure. It forces a recognition that the systems designed to protect can, under certain conditions, fail to do so, and that when they fail, the consequences are not abstract. They are deeply personal, irreversible, and far-reaching. The narrative that emerged in the immediate aftermath of her disappearance, of a child who had been dropped off at school and never arrived, was powerful precisely because it fit into a familiar framework. It allowed people to imagine a scenario they understood, one in which danger existed outside the home, in the spaces between known points. But as the investigation unfolded, that framework collapsed, replaced by something far more difficult to confront: the realization that the danger had been internal, that the narrative itself had been constructed to obscure the truth, and that the trust placed in that narrative had delayed the recognition of what had really happened. This is where the case intersects with a broader understanding of how truth is established and how easily it can be diverted. The initial account was not extraordinary. It was ordinary, and that is what made it effective. It did not raise immediate suspicion because it aligned with expectation. And in that alignment, it created a window of time in which the reality of the situation remained hidden. It is a reminder that deception does not always rely on complexity. Sometimes, it relies on simplicity, on telling a story that sounds exactly the way people expect it to sound. As the layers of that story were removed, what emerged was not only the sequence of events that led to Tylea's death, but the pattern of actions that followed it, the concealment of her body, the transportation to Pimpama River, the construction of a false timeline, and the continued reinforcement of that timeline even as the search intensified. These actions were not isolated decisions. They were part of a sustained effort to manage perception, to control the narrative in a way that distanced the truth from those seeking it. And while that effort ultimately failed, it succeeded for long enough to shape the early stages of the investigation, demonstrating how critical those initial hours and assumptions can be. In reflecting on this case, it is also important to consider the role of recognition, how and when the signs of something being wrong become visible, and what happens when they are not immediately understood. The absence of evidence that Tyler had arrived at school, the inconsistencies in the accounts provided, the lack of confirmation from those who should have seen her, these were the elements that gradually shifted the direction of the investigation. But they did so over time, through accumulation, rather than through a single, decisive moment. This gradual process is characteristic of many cases where the truth is obscured by deliberate action. It requires persistence, attention to detail, and a willingness to question what initially appears to be certain. And in this case, it was that process that ultimately brought the truth to light. But beyond the investigative and legal dimensions, there is the question of how this story is held in memory. True crime, as a form of storytelling, often walks a narrow line between documentation and interpretation, between presenting facts and shaping the way those facts are perceived. In telling this story, the focus remains on accuracy, on resisting the urge to embellish or dramatize beyond what is known, and on maintaining a clear distinction between what can be established and what cannot. This is not a story that requires embellishment. The facts themselves are sufficient to convey its gravity, its complexity, and its impact. To add to them would be to risk distorting the reality that already exists. That commitment to accuracy is also a form of respect for Tyler Palmer, whose life and death are not narrative devices, but real events with real consequences, and respect for the process by which those events were investigated and understood. It is a recognition that behind every case are individuals whose experiences cannot be reduced to a sequence of plot points, and that the responsibility of telling such stories lies in preserving their integrity. In the end, what remains is not a sense of resolution, but a series of reflections that extend beyond the boundaries of the case itself. The importance of vigilance in systems of care, the necessity of questioning narratives that go unverified, the recognition that harm can exist in places that appear safe, and that identifying that harm requires more than surface-level assurance. These are not conclusions that bring closure, but they are conclusions that carry forward, influencing how similar situations are approached in the future. And perhaps that is where the story finds its final meaning, not in the events themselves, which are fixed and unchangeable, but in the way those events inform what comes next, in the policies that are reviewed, in the procedures that are adjusted, in the awareness that is raised when cases like this are brought into public view. These are incremental changes, often slow and difficult, but they represent a response to what has been learned, a way of ensuring that the impact of the case is not limited to the moment in which it occurred. For Tyler Palmer, that impact is part of the legacy she leaves behind, not by intention, but by circumstance. A legacy that exists in the questions her case continues to raise, in the attention it brings to the vulnerabilities within systems of care, and in the ongoing effort to address those vulnerabilities in ways that are both practical and meaningful. It is not the kind of legacy anyone would choose, but it is one that carries weight, one that persists beyond the confines of the case file and into the broader conversation about how societies protect those who depend on them most. And so, the story ends not with a final answer, but with an understanding, quiet, persistent, and unresolved, that what happened to Tyler Palmer was not only a tragedy in itself, but a reflection of larger dynamics that continue to exist and that require continued attention, scrutiny, and change if they are to be confronted effectively. In the final analysis, when a narrative has been fully reconstructed and every confirmed detail has been placed in its proper sequence, what remains is not simply a closed case, but a lasting imprint of how truth can be delayed, distorted, and ultimately revealed through persistence. The story of Tyler Palmer does not rely on mystery in the traditional sense. There is no unresolved suspect, no ambiguous ending, but it does leave behind a different kind of uncertainty, one rooted in the recognition that the most critical elements of the case were hidden in plain sight for a period of time. That recognition forces a reconsideration of how certainty is formed, particularly in the earliest stages of an investigation, when narratives are still fragile and often shaped by the first available account. In this case, that account came from Rick Thorburn, whose statement that he had dropped Tyler off at school established an initial framework that guided early assumptions. It was a framework built on familiarity, on the expectation that a caregiver's account would be truthful, and on the absence of immediate evidence to the contrary. Yet, as the investigation progressed, that framework proved to be not only inaccurate, but intentionally misleading. The unraveling of that initial claim illustrates a fundamental aspect of investigative work. That truth is not always immediately accessible, and that it often emerges through contradiction rather than confirmation. Each inconsistency, each absence of evidence where evidence should have existed, served as a point of pressure on the narrative, gradually exposing its weaknesses. There was no single moment in which the truth became undeniable. Instead, it was revealed incrementally through a process that required both patience and scrutiny. This process underscores the importance of verification, particularly in cases where the stakes are high and the initial narrative appears credible. It also highlights the limitations of relying solely on statements without corroboration, especially when those statements originate from individuals who may have a vested interest in shaping the outcome of the investigation. Beyond the investigative dimension, the case also offers a perspective on the nature of accountability. The legal system ultimately reached a clear conclusion. Rick Thorburn was responsible for the murder of Tylee Palmer, and his actions were not accidental but intentional, carried out within a broader context that included prior abuse and subsequent concealment. That conclusion was supported not only by the facts of the case, but by the pattern of behavior that followed the act itself. Accountability, in this sense, extended beyond the moment of death to include the decisions made afterward, the choice to hide the body, to construct a false narrative, and to maintain that narrative in the face of growing scrutiny. These actions were not peripheral. They were central to understanding the nature of the crime and the mindset behind it. They demonstrated an awareness of wrongdoing and an effort to evade its consequences, reinforcing the conclusion that the act was deliberate. At the same time, the case brings into focus the broader concept of responsibility, which operates on multiple levels. There is individual responsibility, clearly established through the conviction and sentencing. But there's also systemic responsibility, reflected in the examination of how a child within the foster care system in Queensland could remain in an environment where harm was occurring without effective intervention. This aspect of the case does not diminish individual culpability, but it does expand the scope of reflection, prompting questions about how systems can better fulfill their protective role. It is important, however, to approach this reflection with precision, avoiding the tendency to generalize beyond what the case itself demonstrates. The failure in this instance was specific, rooted in particular circumstances and decisions. Yet, it also serves as an example of the kinds of vulnerabilities that can exist within systems that rely on trust, oversight, and reporting mechanisms that may not always capture what is happening beneath the surface. The challenge, then, is to translate that example into meaningful improvements without oversimplifying the complexity of the system as a whole. Another dimension of the case that continues to resonate is the role of narrative, how stories are constructed, how they are accepted, and how they are eventually challenged. The initial narrative of a school drop-off was effective because it aligned with expectation. It did not require elaboration or justification. It fit within a pattern that people recognized. This alignment allowed it to function as a temporary truth, guiding the early stages of the investigation until evidence began to contradict it. The eventual dismantling of that narrative illustrates the dynamic relationship between story and evidence, showing how one can be used to obscure the other, and how the latter ultimately prevails when examined rigorously. This dynamic is not unique to this case, but it is particularly evident here, where the contrast between the constructed narrative and the actual sequence of events is so stark. In considering how this case is remembered, it is essential to maintain that distinction between narrative and fact. ensuring that the story is grounded in what has been established rather than in what might be inferred or imagined. This approach not only preserves accuracy, but also respects the reality of what occurred, avoiding the distortions that can arise when stories are shaped to fit expectations rather than evidence. Ultimately, the story of Tyler Palmer is one that resists simplification. It is not defined by a single moment or a single factor, but by a convergence of elements, individual actions, systemic conditions, and the interplay between truth and deception. It is a case that demonstrates how harm can be both immediate and prolonged, how it can be concealed and then revealed, and how the process of uncovering that harm is often as complex as the harm itself. In the end, what remains is a clear understanding of what happened, even if the deeper questions of why and how such conditions were allowed to exist are more difficult to answer fully. That understanding carries with it a responsibility to apply what has been learned, to recognize the patterns that may appear in other contexts, and to respond in ways that prioritize protection, transparency, and accountability. It also carries a more personal dimension, the acknowledgement of a life that was lost, not as an abstract case, but as an individual whose absence continues to be felt. That acknowledgement does not resolve the case, but it ensures that it is not reduced to a set of facts alone. It keeps the focus where it belongs, on the human reality at the center of the story, and on the importance of ensuring that such realities are not overlooked or forgotten. In the final chapter of this story, when every documented fact has been accounted for and every legal conclusion has been rendered, what remains is a quiet, enduring question, not about what happened, because that has been established, but about what it means to truly understand a case like this. The story of Tyler Palmer is not defined solely by the sequence of events that led to her death, nor by the conviction of Rick Thorburn, but by the space it occupies in the broader conversation about trust, protection, and the limits of systems designed to safeguard those who cannot protect themselves. It is a story that begins with a child placed into care, into a structure intended to provide stability, and ends with the recognition that this structure, in this instance, did not fulfill its purpose. But between those 2 points lies a series of decisions, individual, collective, and systemic, that shape the outcome in ways that cannot be ignored. To understand the significance of this case, it is necessary to look beyond the immediate facts and consider the patterns they reveal. The initial narrative of a routine school drop-off, the absence of evidence to support that narrative, the gradual emergence of inconsistencies, and the eventual uncovering of a deliberate act of violence. These elements form a pattern that speaks to how truth can be obscured and then rediscovered. It is a pattern that underscores the importance of questioning assumptions, particularly when those assumptions are based on familiarity rather than verification. The claim that Tyler had been dropped off at school was accepted, initially, because it fit within a framework that people recognized and trusted. It was only when that claim was tested against evidence that its fragility became apparent. This process of testing, of comparing narrative to fact, is at the core of investigative work. And in this case, it was the mechanism through which the truth was ultimately revealed. But the revelation of truth, while essential, does not in itself resolve the deeper implications of the case. Those implications extend into the realm of responsibility, where the actions of individuals intersect with the structures that surround them. The conviction of Rick Thorburn established personal accountability, confirming that the death of Tyler Palmer was the result of an intentional act, carried out within a context that included prior abuse and subsequent concealment. This finding is clear, definitive, and supported by the evidence presented. Yet, it exists alongside a broader context in which the conditions that allowed that act to occur were not fully recognized or addressed in time to prevent it. This duality between individual culpability and systemic vulnerability is one of the most challenging aspects of the case. It requires an acknowledgement that responsibility operates on multiple levels, and that addressing one does not eliminate the need to examine the other. In Queensland, the response to the case included a re-examination of foster care processes, an effort to identify how oversight could be strengthened and how risks could be more effectively managed. These responses are part of an ongoing process, one that reflects the understanding that systems must evolve in response to the cases that expose their limitations. However, evolution is not instantaneous, and it is not absolute. It is incremental, shaped by the accumulation of lessons learned and the willingness to apply those lessons in practical ways. The story of Tyale Palmer contributes to that process, not as a singular example, but as part of a broader body of cases that inform how protection is approached and implemented. Another element that remains central to the case is the role of silence, not only in the sense of what was not said, but in the sense of what was not recognized. The abuse that was later uncovered did not immediately lead to intervention, and the narrative that followed Tyale's death was accepted, at least initially, without contradiction. These aspects of the case highlight the challenges inherent in identifying harm that is concealed, particularly when it exists within environments that appear stable on the surface. They also emphasize the importance of creating conditions in which disclosure is possible, in which inconsistencies are examined, and in which assumptions are not allowed to override evidence. This is not a simple task, and it is one that requires sustained attention, resources, and a commitment to ongoing evaluation. In reflecting on how this story is told, there is also a responsibility to maintain clarity and accuracy, to resist the temptation to fill gaps with speculation or to shape the narrative in ways that extend beyond what is supported by the evidence. The facts of the case are sufficient to convey its gravity, and the integrity of those facts must be preserved in order to ensure that the story remains grounded in reality. This approach not only respects the process by which the truth was established, but also honors the individual at the center of the case, whose life and death are not abstract concepts, but real events with lasting consequences. Tyale Palmer is not a symbol or a narrative device. She was a child whose life was cut short under circumstances that should never have occurred. Keeping that focus is essential, particularly in a context where stories of crime can sometimes shift attention away from victims and toward perpetrators. The emphasis here remains on the impact of the loss, on the absence that follows, and on the need to ensure that such losses are not repeated. As this story reaches its conclusion, it does so without the sense of finality that often accompanies fictional narratives. There is no resolution that restores what has been lost, no ending that fully reconciles the events that have been described. Instead, there is a continuation of reflection, of inquiry, of efforts to apply what has been learned in ways that extend beyond this single case. That continuation is, in many ways, the most meaningful outcome that can be derived from a situation that offers no true resolution. It represents a commitment to using the knowledge gained to inform future actions, to strengthen systems, and to remain vigilant in the face of the kinds of risks that this case has brought to light. In the end, the story of Tyale Palmer is not one that can be neatly concluded. It remains open, not in terms of facts or accountability, but in terms of its implications and its impact. It is a story that continues to resonate because it touches on fundamental questions about safety, trust, and responsibility, questions that do not have fixed answers, but that must be revisited in different contexts with a willingness to learn and to adapt. And perhaps that is where its lasting significance lies, not in the details that have been established, but in the ongoing process of understanding what those details mean and how they can be used to prevent similar tragedies in the future. In the final stretch of this story, After every formal conclusion has been reached and every institutional response has begun to take shape, there is still a need to sit with what cannot be resolved through investigation or judgment alone, the human aftermath that continues long after the case itself is closed. The story of Tyler Palmer does not end with a verdict or a sentence, because the impact of what happened extends far beyond those boundaries, reaching into the ways people understand safety, trust, and the unseen realities that can exist behind ordinary lives. What makes this case particularly enduring is not just the sequence of events that led to Tyler's death, but the clarity with which those events expose a deeper tension, the gap between what is believed and what is true. For a period of time, the narrative that she had been dropped off at school existed without challenge, accepted because it aligned with expectation, because it came from a source that was presumed to be reliable, and because there was no immediate reason to doubt it. That acceptance is not a failure in itself. It is a reflection of how people navigate everyday life, relying on patterns and trust to make sense of the world. But in this case, that reliance created a delay in recognizing the reality that lay beneath the surface, illustrating how easily truth can be obscured when it is replaced by something that appears plausible. The eventual dismantling of that narrative required more than suspicion. It required evidence, persistence, and a willingness to question what had initially seemed certain. It required investigators to move beyond the framework that had been provided and to reconstruct events based on what could be verified rather than what had been claimed. This process is often slow, and it is rarely linear. It involves revisiting assumptions, re-examining details, and acknowledging that the first version of events is not always the correct one. In the case of Tyler Palmer, this process ultimately led to a clear understanding of what had occurred, but it also highlighted the challenges inherent in uncovering truth when it has been deliberately concealed. Beyond the investigative and legal dimensions, the case also raises questions about how individuals and communities process events that contradict fundamental expectations. The idea that harm can occur within a home, within a relationship defined by care and responsibility, is difficult to reconcile. It challenges deeply held beliefs about where safety resides and how it is maintained. When those beliefs are disrupted, the response is often a combination of disbelief, anger, and a search for explanations that can restore a sense of order. But not all events can be fully explained in ways that provide comfort. Some remain as stark reminders of vulnerability, of the limitations of systems, and of a need for ongoing vigilance. In Queensland, the case prompted a reevaluation of foster care practices, an effort to identify how oversight could be improved and how risks could be more effectively managed. These efforts are part of a broader commitment to learning from what has happened, to ensuring that the lessons of this case are not lost or overlooked. Yet, it is important to recognize that systemic change is a gradual process, one that requires not only policy adjustments, but also cultural awareness, training, and the allocation of resources necessary to support meaningful implementation. The existence of reform does not erase the circumstances that led to it, but it does represent an attempt to address those circumstances in a way that reduces the likelihood of repetition. Another aspect of the case that continues to resonate is the role of accountability beyond the individual level. While Rick Thorburn was held legally responsible for the murder, the actions of other members of the household, those who provided misleading information or failed to disclose relevant details, also formed part of the broader context in which the crime was concealed. This dimension of the case underscores the idea that harm is not always the result of a single action, but can be sustained or exacerbated by the choices of others, whether through direct involvement or through the decision to remain silent. It is a reminder that accountability can extend beyond the primary act. encompassing the network of decisions that surround it. At the same time, the case invites reflection on how stories like this are told and understood over time. True crime narratives often risk becoming detached from the realities they describe, shaped by repetition, interpretation, and the passage of time. Maintaining a focus on accuracy, on the distinction between what is known and what is not, is essential to preserving the integrity of the story. It ensures that the case is not reduced to a series of dramatic elements, but remains grounded in the facts that define it. This approach also serves to center the narrative on the individual whose life was lost, rather than on the actions of the perpetrator. Tyle Palmer is not simply the subject of a case. She is the reason the case exists at all. Keeping that perspective is crucial, particularly in a context where the details of the crime can overshadow the person at its center. As this story approaches its conclusion, it does so with an understanding that not all aspects of what happened can be neatly resolved. There are elements that remain complex, that resist simplification, and that continue to prompt reflection long after the formal proceedings have ended. These elements are not gaps in the narrative, but part of its reality, reflecting the fact that human events, particularly those involving harm and loss, do not always conform to clear or complete explanations. What can be taken from this case, however, is a set of insights that extend beyond its specific details. The importance of verifying information, the need for systems to adapt in response to identified weaknesses, and the recognition that trust, while necessary, must be accompanied by accountability and oversight. These insights are not conclusions in the traditional sense, but they represent a form of understanding that can inform future actions. In the end, the story of Tyle Palmer remains as a quiet but persistent presence, one that does not fade with time, but continues to influence how similar situations are approached and understood. It is a story that does not offer closure in a conventional way, but instead leaves behind a responsibility to remember, to reflect, and to apply what has been learned in ways that honor the reality of what occurred. And in that responsibility, there is a recognition that while the past cannot be changed, the future can be shaped by the willingness to confront difficult truths and to act on them with clarity and purpose.